Welcome to the fifth video in this series explaining the externalist theory of portalism. Portalism claims that all biological systems across the zone of life are conscious to some degree. This includes the animal kingdom as well as the plant and protist kingdoms. In this video, I will explain not only how all living organisms can be conscious, but how all life cannot not be conscious. As I explain in video 3 of this series, the all-encompassing horizon of consciousness is a fifth fundamental force of nature and the irreducible ontological ground of subjective experience. The theory of portalism holds that access to this horizon of consciousness is realized through a connection or portal, which all living organisms possess in some form. Once this portal passage is established, an individualized localization of consciousness is autogenically manifested, wherein mind becomes actualized. The character of any consciousness, in terms of its depth of experience and width of its reality, is determined by the sophistication of its portal, and the depth of subjective experience expands commensurate to the development of the portal mechanism. All that is required for individual consciousness, meaning mind, is a portal, an ontogenetic component of any given biological system, meaning that given a functional portal, a biological system, be it animal, plant, or protozoa, cannot not be conscious. First-person experience is an individual phenomenon. Only I have actual knowledge of how I feel, and this actuality extends no further than me. Yet third-person descriptions of the experiences of others are all too often like my own, so it is upon this environment of similarity that we are able to participate in discussions on human consciousness from first-hand expertise. In the broadest view, each of us understands the something like there is to be, a human, as it applies to each of us, and once this is established, that understanding can be projected onto the rest of the species, giving us all a reasonable idea of what it is for others to be human by virtue of being human ourselves. But this idea falls down when we begin to talk about the consciousness of non-humans. Although we might have a good idea of what it is to be like a human being, as Thomas Nagel famously reminds us, we have no idea what it is like to be a bat. Pondering the consciousness of other living things is to speculate based on comparisons to the only minds we are familiar with, these being our own. We can only visualize being a bat by imagining ourselves in a furry bat suit, flying around, hanging upside down, snatching up moths in mid-flight. These are bat behaviors that we have observed, but this is far from being a bat. It actually amounts to no more than visualizing ourselves as what we imagine something like there is to be a bat might be like. We can do no more, and what we are able to do is insufficient to our purposes. This state of affairs is partly the reason that most philosophers and scientists refuse to believe that any non-human life can be conscious, and that all of the actions that animals take are somehow essential innate behaviors. Others grudgingly accept that the higher primates, and perhaps dolphins and whales, might have some degree of consciousness, but certainly not extending to self-awareness. Very few would argue that turtles, insects, mollusks, or pine trees have consciousness. I believe that to assume so is not only anthropocentric arrogance, but also unscientific in the sense that the nature of non-human consciousness, or even consciousness simpliciter, cannot be evaluated using human consciousness as the metric. This points to one's definition of consciousness. Human beings are aware of their environment and navigate this environment through the disclosure of sense data to mind. My eye sees a cabin on the ground in front of me, sends the electromagnetic sensory data to processing centers in my brain through which it is immediately disclosed to mind, wherein I, as mind, being in the world, assign context and meaning to the object, evaluate it, and decide to act in some way regarding it. This exact sequence would be the same for a horse or a snake or a bird. If we stop here, I can conclude that the horse, the snake, and the bird are equally as conscious as I am. But as a human being, I can also create art, read and write, compose music, and use abstract reasoning as in logic and mathematics, and to my knowledge, no non-human beings within my reality are capable of these actions. How then do I draw the conclusion that only humans can be conscious? I can't, because that conclusion does not follow from the facts. To do so would be to judge the presence of consciousness by using human subjective experience as the evaluative metric. Since the horse, the snake, and the bird are able to navigate their realities, they are clearly conscious, yet just as clearly limited in the depth of content within their respective subjective experience. Thus, it would be more plausible to conclude that the content of consciousness for any given organism across the zone of life is a matter of degree. Considering the higher animals and birds, if you own a cat or dog, if you raise livestock, if you are a hunter, it should be readily apparent to you that animals are demonstrably conscious of themselves, other animals, and of their immediate environment. Animals are certainly aware, so what is the difference between their consciousness and human consciousness? With the possible exception of certain species of higher primates, non-human animal consciousness is not reflexive, meaning that they are not aware that they are aware. In addition, they cannot reason abstractly and are unable to determine what is not the case. Nevertheless, they are conscious of their surroundings and of their presence in and their relationship to those surroundings. They lead social and emotional lives, they grieve, and they remember. Although non-human animals do not have the language sophistication necessary to communicate subjective experience to one another, they do reason. Just place a can of tuna on a high shelf and watch the cat work the problem. Hang a bird feeder from a chain with a rat catcher on it and watch the squirrel strategize, formulate, execute, fail, reformulate, and learn. All of these are examples of intelligence, as they include problem-solving, reasoning, planning, and learning. They are examples of memory. The next time the squirrel sees a fully loaded bird feeder, it will attack it using the previous winning strategy first. If this fails, due to some modification in the feeder suspension, the squirrel will begin the process of improving its strategy. Such behavior is clearly indicative of the animal's capability to negotiate its reality through its ability to problem solve. All animals have some procedural memory, how to bury nuts, how to swim, how to spin a web. But these examples are also indicative of explicit memory, particularly episodic memory. Pets recognize their owners. The squirrel remembers where the nuts are. The cat understands that to get to the tuna first requires a jump to the counter, followed by a leap to the top of the refrigerator. When I go to my office in the morning and turn on the light in my aquarium, the fish rise to the top, expecting to be fed. Certainly this is a Pavlovian response, but it nevertheless requires memory. Consciousness is a necessary condition for memory cognition. If we accept the definition that memory is the retention of information over time for the purpose of influencing future action, then memory presupposes consciousness. I turn now to communication. If a squirrel sees a cat, it will bark a warning unmistakably interpreted by other squirrels and even other forest animals as the presence of a threat. In addition, birdsong can be highly communicative, as can dog barks and the attitude of a cat's tail. These are examples of communication, and certainly they lack the infinite combinations of syntax and semantics that are inherent in language proper. But what is important here is that functionally, information is being exchanged. The fact is that the process of interpretation, decoding, and the ultimate assignment of meaning to audiovisual input occurs in mind. The brain can't do it. Certainly, through its sensory modalities, the brain gathers and processes the audiovisual data of communications, but it is not capable of rising to the level of cognition. Language and communication presuppose consciousness. Finally, consider the lower animals on the taxonomic scale. How can consciousness possibly be attributed to them? Remember that the key lies in the abandonment of preconceived anthropocentric assumptions about what constitutes mind. For example, the inchworm crawling up my arm is a miracle of biology and chemistry, millions of specialized cells working harmoniously in their inchwormness. If I bar its way with my finger, it will rise upon its little back feet and begin looking for an alternate path. It will try one, then another, perhaps eventually climbing onto the finger itself. This is indicative of problem solving, and the inchworm is certainly conscious, for if it were not, there would be no way in which it could navigate its reality, as without consciousness it would have no reality to navigate. Reality can only be experienced subjectively, and to experience the world requires consciousness. That which is unconscious experiences nothing. The reality of the inchworm is certainly limited in comparison to higher life forms, yet even that limited reality is nevertheless subjectively experienced. The inchworm concerns itself with little more in life than finding food and avoiding death at the hands of its predators long enough to transform itself into a moth and lay its eggs. That which passes for the inchworm's brain collects data through its sense modalities, but the subsequent processing of that data into that which stands for inchworm information requires a mind, primitive though it may be by human standards. How conscious is the inchworm? The inchworm is as conscious as inchworms need to be. And what about the protist kingdom? It's not difficult to extend these same characterizations of animal consciousness onto paramecium, hydra, or single-celled life, such as amoebas and bacteria. Even with only a single cell, these animals are possessed with what biologists call microbial intelligence, and the presence of intelligence presupposes consciousness. The conclusion is that even single-celled animals must therefore be conscious to at least some degree. To be sure, the content of an amoeba's subjective reality may consist of no more than a binary proposition, determining that a contact is food or not food, together with some biochemical flag that indicates when it is time to split in two. Having abandoned using human experiential parameters as the metric, it becomes reasonable to accept that the character of consciousness can come to us in many forms. Perhaps the philosopher David Chalmers characterizes it best when he observes, and I quote, "Where there is simple information processing, there is simple experience, and when there is complex information processing, there is complex experience." End quote. Having addressed the animal kingdom, I now make the same argument for the consciousness of plants. It is over this distinction that even the most radical thinkers often draw the line by rejecting any idea that plant consciousness can exist, even though recent advances in plant neurobiology tell a different story, with experiments and research indicating that plant consciousness is certainly within the realm of plausibility. When we examine arguments denying that plant consciousness is possible, we often uncover the appeal to anthropocentric speciesism. But just as it is within the animal hierarchy, the case for plant consciousness is dependent upon one's definition, and when we formulate this definition, we must take care not to fall into the trap of using human consciousness as the comparative metric. The argument for plant consciousness is similar to the one I used previously in making the case for the lower animals, which is that intelligence presupposes consciousness. Intelligence is defined as the ability to solve problems, and recent research in neurobiology has discovered several examples that demonstrate how plants go about doing exactly that. Like animals, plants are indisputably aware of their environment. This awareness extends to air and soil temperature, air pressure, humidity, the direction in which gravity points, soil chemistry, electrical and magnetic fields, and proximity to other plants. They are sensitive to light and put leaves and pine cones in motion in response to it. What is the human ability to see if not a sensitivity to this same light? Based upon the angle of the sun, plants can calculate the time of year. To do this requires memory. Plants are sensitive to vibrations, and experiments with seedling roots show that they alter their downward path of growth toward the source of the vibration. What is human hearing, if not the interpretation of vibrations? such as that of a guitar string being plucked. In a particularly compelling experiment by the Italian botanist Stefano Mancuso, a pole is placed equidistant between two bean plants in an otherwise empty room. Using time-lapse photography, we see the plants begin to grow feelers called tendrils that begin moving in sweeping arcs as they search for a contact to latch onto. But the plant on the left sends its tendril to the right, while the plant on the right sends its tendril to the left. How do they know where the pole is? This is the equivalent of human blind sight, wherein a blind person will reach in the correct direction for an apple that they cannot possibly see, yet they sense that it is there. This is likely because although the blind person and the plant are both deprived of eyesight, they are nevertheless still connected to the world. When the plant on the left finally makes contact with the pole, it secures it. What is compelling about this experiment is that when the plant on the right eventually locates the same pole, it somehow understands that there is already another plant secured to it and sends its tendril off to search for an unclaimed pole. In essence, feeling without hands. Plants are also capable of kin recognition, and they communicate. When we walk through a field and observe a stand of trees, we might think that we are seeing 5 or 6 individual trees, but the reality is that we are actually looking at one big tree. This is because we only see the superficial representation of the trees and not the massively extensive network of roots that lies underneath. And it is below the surface that a plant's neural equivalent of animal brains and nervous systems can be found. These root systems extend more than double the spread of a tree's crown, intersecting with and growing into the roots of their neighbors. The roots penetrate into dense communities of fungal colonies called hyphae, which form vegetative networks collectively known as mycelium. It is difficult to overlook the functional similarity between the plant mycelium system and the synaptic neural network of the animal nervous system. For example, envisioning a teaspoon of soil containing many miles of hyphae is not unlike imagining the 100 billion neurons in the human brain, or understanding the explanation of information transmission across this fungal network as being comparable to a biologically realistic connectionist model of a neural network. Some might argue that an equivalence between the mechanics of the fungal root symbiosis, otherwise known as a mycorrhizal association, and the synaptic neural networks of animals is inappropriate, as a neural network can transmit information from the little toe to the brain in about 120 milliseconds at roughly 275 miles an hour, while information passing from roots to branches or to other trees can take hours, even days. This would be a fair objection if I was claiming identity, or that one system is in some manner more efficient or powerful than the other, but my claim is only that they are functionally similar. The term intelligence is critical to the claim that at least some degree of consciousness inheres in all living things. In the interest of clarity, I will define the term intelligence as the capacity for logic, understanding, learning, reasoning, planning, and problem solving, the actualization of intelligence being applicable to any organism possessing all or any one of those properties. The capacities of intelligence can only be actualized in mind, and there is nothing unconscious that is intelligent. Portalism holds that consciousness, as the ability to experience reality, is inherent in all living things. To be living is the condition that distinguishes organisms from inorganic objects and dead organisms, living being manifested by growth through metabolism, reproduction, and the power of adaptation to environment through changes originating internally. In all forms of life, metabolism and reproduction require, at a minimum, the intelligent capabilities of problem solving. To solve problems, a thing must first experience its reality, as it is that reality that furnishes the problems to be overcome, and there can be no experience outside of consciousness. No matter how primitive or sophisticated an organism's reality might be, that organism must be conscious in order to navigate that reality. Therefore, all living things are conscious by definition. The argument for the presence of consciousness throughout the zone of life is elegantly simple. involving 3 premises and a single conclusion. All living things are capable of problem solving. Problem solving presupposes intelligence. Intelligence presupposes consciousness. Therefore, all living things are conscious. Aside from how advanced or primitive a plant or animal might be, by virtue of its portal mechanism, consciousness inheres in all living things and is the necessary condition for subjective experience. The depth of an organism's phenomenal experience is dependent upon the sophistication of its portal mechanism, which is sufficient to each organism's ability to navigate its reality. In light of the wide diversity of a given organism's capacity for subjective experience, all living things are as conscious as they need to be. Thank you for watching this video on Portalism's concept of consciousness throughout the zone of life, and I hope that you find my arguments at least plausible, if not convincing. I should mention here that in my book, Portalism, an Externalist Theory of Consciousness, I go into far more detail in terms of arguments, examples, and research in support of my claim for consciousness across the zone of life. The book is due to be released in early 2022, and you can find more information at the website shown here. There are 2 videos left in this series, and in the next I offer my arguments for downward causality, wherein mind, as the agent, can cause a physical event, a concept rejected by physicalists, yet one that is necessary if portalism is true. I think you'll find it interesting, and I hope to see you soon.